My name is Raul Rivera, and this is the first video of my personal project for the SYI Summer Internship. Through this project, I hope to focus on how predominantly white congregations can help advance the fight for social justice for marginalized communities. Today, we are talking about white privilege. What types of feelings do you personally get when you think about the term white privilege? To many people, white privilege might bring a feeling of uncomfortableness. Maybe you might feel offended by the term white privilege. Or you might personally feel a certain way about white privilege because you know how it affects you every single day. So what is white privilege?
White privilege is the term given for the social, religious, political, and structural advantages that have been given to classified white people, and I'd probably put in parentheses, descendants of the European nation states.
So I like to think about white privilege, and anytime I talk about privilege, it's something that is an unearned advantage in the world. So sometimes people are not necessarily aware that they have white privilege or any form of privilege based on having a dominant identity. And so it's basically when white folks, there are things in the world that they don't have to think about.
This topic has turned into a controversial conversation within many communities. And many times, a big reason for this is because of the misconceptions that come with the term white privilege.
I think some common misconceptions is that it's about not having had worked hard or not having done something. And it's not about that. It's about saying that there are just things that when you go into the world, you might not necessarily have to think about it or reflect on it. And it's an advantage for you navigating the world. So for example, going into the grocery store and finding bandages that match your skin color is white privilege. And it's nothing that you did to control that. It's just because in our culture, we presume that whiteness is the dominant skin color, and therefore products are then made for white folks or white skin. And so that is something that I look at as white privilege. And I think you can look at a number of other examples of it as well.
When talking about what white privilege is, something that can be very prominent at the start of the conversation is that some people don't really understand white privilege, or some people are completely blind to it. This occurs not just in white privilege, but in the intersectionality of privilege that we all have.
It is often hard to see the privilege from which you actually benefit from if you've not been taught to see it that way. Privilege, the very definition of privilege means not having to work or not having to deal with the struggles. And while there is a recognition that white people do have to struggle just like everybody else, and there are struggles, in comparison to other ethnic groups, that struggle is not as intense or not as systematic in that way. So it makes it hard to see.
A lot of people are blind to those issues because it's something that, is constructed in a way that you're not supposed to know about it. And it's sort of this invisible, or what I like to think of as a blank spot that people have, and that is intentional. And I think that's why I think people have a lot of resistance to it in terms of accepting it, because it does, even the word privilege presumes that it is something that you have done to take over or to have more power over someone. And so people don't always like to think of their privilege in that way or think of themselves in that way. I think it brings up a lot of guilt for people because they're like, wait a minute, I can go into the bank and get a loan at this rate, and my Black counterpart who may have the same history and background as me may not necessarily come out with anything. That is something that makes them feel like, well, I didn't do anything about that. I didn't control the world, but it does happen. And so that, I think, is why people have a lot of guilt and shame and resistance toward the term of white privilege.
When looking at the ways that white privilege can occur every single day, I think back on the events that happened in New York City with Amy Cooper. Amy Cooper is a white woman who called the police on a black man named Christian Cooper after he had asked her to please put a leash around her dog. Before she called the police, this man had asked her to put a leash around her dog. When Miss Cooper called the police, she emphasized that an African American man was threatening her. Let's break this down a little bit. Through this phone call, Miss Cooper was lying to the police and decided that it was important to emphasize that she was being threatened by an African American man. She feels comfortable making this call because she believed the police was going to think that her lie was the truth. This is white privilege because Miss Cooper felt that she was in the right to call the police and lie. She thought that because she was a white woman, the police was going to believe her lies. This occurs every single day. And specifically, the actions of a white person calling the police on a person of color because they feel threatened happens every single day and is documented every single day. These videos are noticed on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Accounts like Aunt Karen Zero use these social media platforms to call out and to show the racist moments that occur every single day in our country. Many of these videos being very similar to the same thing that happened to Christian Cooper in New York. When talking about the concept of white privilege, it is very important to also look at the ways that white people are naturally born with these privileges. We have to look at the way that our country is structured to give privileges to white people.
I think based on the definition of an unearned or an invisible advantage, I think that you are born with it if you are a white person. And again, it doesn't mean that you don't find ways to use your privilege and to also try to it's something that you probably can't even give away. I mean, there's a lot of ways that sometimes people think that they can, but I think you can use it in ways to speak with groups that are disadvantaged.
A study done by Retzo Mudzik and Paul Frichters called Still Not Allowed on the Bus looked at the amount of times that different people of racial and ethnic backgrounds could get on a bus if they did not have the amount needed to pay the fee of $3.50. The study took place with 1,500 different encounters. First, the only factor that was noted was the racial and ethnic differences between every participant. It was noted that 72% of white folks were allowed to stay on the bus even if they couldn't pay the fee, while only 32% of black folks were allowed to stay on the bus. To test this further, business wear and military getup were added to see if this would affect the outcome. The outcome showed that when dressed in business wear or military getup, black people more than doubled the amount of times that they could stay on the bus. But when compared to white people, the percentages were the same for black people dressed in business wear and military getup to white people dressed in just casual clothing. But when looking at white people dressed in business wear and military getup, the percentage jumped to the mid-90s. These are the ways that everyday advantages occur in the lives of white people. They aren't big advantages or are things that you can clearly notice, but they happen every single day. And to people of color, these little privileges are noticed. It is also important to note that white privilege isn't the only privilege that is given to people. We can all have different privileges that affect our lives every single day and contribute to the injustice of marginalized groups. It is important to be able to look at all aspects of our lives and see the intersectionality of all of these privileges and all of these discriminatory parts of our lives. This includes looking at the privileges and discrimination in criminal justice, in economic security, in health, and in employment.
We have multiple identities that we hold, and some are more salient than others. So being Black, I think for me, is something that people see it and it's kind of obvious. But maybe people don't know that I grew up Christian. That's not something that unless I reveal that to you, but I have Christian privilege because I understand what it was. I grew up in the church. I have a sense of the rituals and all of those things. And the holidays that I celebrate are mostly Christian holidays that get recognized in like at work. I get days off for Christmas. So we have a number of different privileges based on our just where we are. So in a US context, I have certain privileges that maybe someone else in a different country may not necessarily have. And so I think we also have to think about the context as well. Sometimes we may be thinking about like measuring our privilege or disadvantage based on like how many marginal plus how many like privileged identities. And I think that can be a little limiting, really, because some of those things in different contexts might show up in different ways. So, being Black in a particular in the US, I mean, can be a marginal identity. But then when you talk about the fact that I have a PhD and you start thinking about being upwardly mobile, those are other privileges that inform and don't necessarily take away from the fact that I'm a Black person. But when I think about other Black folks, I also have to remember that I do have a great deal of privilege that allows me, to go into rooms and not be questioned in certain ways as well.
Having these conversations to help educate and to help you understand the ideas of white privilege can feel really uncomfortable. But it is important to lean into the uncomfortability of this subject, because that is what is going to cause you to see the problem and to be able to make a change.